Africa is a continent endowed with immense natural and human resources and great cultural, ecological, and economic diversity. But despite these strengths, the continent remains underdeveloped. So, what is preventing Africa from developing as a continent? If we look at what's coming into Africa in terms of aid and foreign assistance, and what's going out of Africa in terms of profits, tax evasion, and debt payments, Africa could be considered wealthy. In fact, Africa is financing other continents. The problems lie both inside and outside of Africa, and are many times connected to selfish practices of African authorities and other countries, as well as unfair international relationships. So, what challenges does the continent face on all levels, from the people to the politics and country relationships, from the businesses to the economy, and how do other nations play a role in the continent's success? Well, most African nations suffer from military dictatorships, corruption, civil unrest and war, underdevelopment, and poverty. All of these things lead to a multitude of other negative situations. Numerous development strategies have failed to yield the expected results, but despite difficult challenges, Africa has immense potential. 44 African countries were surveyed in the World Happiness Report in 2017. This report was conducted by the United Nations, and according to the citizens, the main problems facing the continent are as follows: poor governance, corruption, unemployment, insecurity, this means civil war, crime, and political instability, population growth, and droughts and famine. There are also a couple of less obvious problems impacting Africa that don't directly affect the citizens, but usually create the problems that do. These are Africa's geographical disadvantage, the misplacement of international aid, unfair trade policies, as well as education and the knowledge gap. I'll elaborate on all of these topics throughout the presentation. First off, poor governance. African countries have undergone two major governmental reforms in recent history and are now in the midst of a third. First, there was colonial rule, which was short enough to destroy leadership in Africa, but was not long enough to replace it with anything. Colonialists created the 54 African countries arbitrarily, literally just a group of people in Europe looking at the geography of Africa and drawing lines where they think countries should be. So this divided the African people and the original systems that were in place. Second, there was liberation from colonial rule, but because the whole governmental system was weak, this allowed military dictatorships to form in the new African countries. And now, many African countries are struggling to get proper democratic governance. There are only 9 out of 54 countries that are considered democratic as of 2019. Relating well to poor governance, there is corruption. Corruption is a major issue in Africa and is present throughout all levels of politics, from the police to the country leaders. Bribery can dictate simple things like access to medical care, schools, and jobs, as well as pivotal decisions like award of contracts and use of public resources. The laws on corruption are lenient, and those who are caught will not face hard consequences. Health Poverty Action quotes, "While 134 billion flows in each year, predominantly in the form of loans, foreign investment, and aid, 102 billion is taken out, mainly in profits made by foreign companies, tax evasion, and the costs of adapting to climate change."
Our country is really rich, but people are not really taking benefit of it.
This is the Democratic Republic of Congo. It could be Saudi Arabia, but some of the biggest thieves in the world are in charge here. And $24 trillion of wealth under the ground trickles into a very few pockets.
Corruption among African leaders is rampant and is one of the most important factors in the continent's future. Sub-Saharan Africa is home to many of the world's longest ruling heads of state. Some post-colonial leaders in the 60s and 70s sought to become president for life, taking advantage of the new weak political system. Every year, Africa loses between $30 and $60 billion to illicit financial flows, according to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. President Johnson Sirleaf is a Liberian politician who served from 2006 to 2018. She was the first elected female head of state in Africa, and in an interview with a reporter, she said, "Maybe I should have sacked the whole government when I came into power. Africa is not poor, it is poorly managed." Here are a couple quotes from African citizens when they were interviewed. "As we grew up in Kenya, we were told stories praising the rich men who had become so by stealing public funds or money from their employers. Anybody who handles public funds for some time but goes back home with nothing is considered the greatest of fools. However, we have to fight corruption day and night and teach our children that riches come through hard work and being responsible, not by stealing public funds. This is a citizen in Kenya. I don't care who you are or what part of Africa you come from, but the truth is you are either corrupt or have been involved in a number of corrupt practices. Corruption is part of African culture. It's a way of life. You have to give something if you want things to go your way. It's a way of saying thank you. This is a quote from a citizen in the country of Togo.
Nous privilégierons la mise à contribution de nos ressources naturelles pour mobiliser les financements nécessaires à l'industrialisation.
And boy does he make those natural resources available. But not to guys like Janique. We met him on the street and he offered to show us his Kinshasa.
Nothing's going on in this country. At this time, we don't have power, so there's no way for you to do, work task at all, even to cook. Let me show you. This is the place I'm living. These are my sisters, and she's one is a pupil, and the one that doesn't study because of means. We don't have money to pay for educations.
Corruption can also affect the ways that small businesses operate, even if they're not corrupt themselves. Mumo Musiva is a Kenyan architect. He knows the country and the small businesses well by his connection to the real estate market. He says that the small business people will generally avoid contact with the government altogether out of pure mistrust. He talks about a specific case in Eastleigh, a marketplace within Kibera, one of the largest slums in Africa. He says that if Eastleigh traders trusted the government, they might pay some taxes in return for decent services, so creating a virtuous cycle. He says it would lift people out of poverty. Remember, poverty is related to quality of life, and the quality of life here is appalling despite the huge amount of wealth flowing in through these areas. The young Kenyan architect added another insight. Africa is not poor, he said. Africa is just poorly managed. And this is almost identical to what Liberian President Johnson Sirleaf said some 5,000 kilometers away on the other side of the continent. Corruption is massively important and is a recurring theme in African development.
Why is there so much poverty where there is so much potential wealth? One answer came when Vocative was approached by a government tax inspector willing to be interviewed at great personal risk. Vocative agreed to conceal his identity and alter his voice.
DRC cannot live without its mineral resources. In East of Congo there is many mining companies, and all of those companies, they earn money and people are still being poor.
Our source explained that when the mining companies receive a tax bill, they simply reach out to their contacts in the government, all the way up to cabinet-level positions in the Ministries of Finance and Mining.
In that time, the Minister of Finance arranged and called the tax administration and said to them, don't ask any money, you stop.
According to our source, only 5% of taxes owed by mining companies are ever collected by the government.
This is tax avoid tax evasion. Real problem here that taxes are only covered by the medium people. Those powerful men, like ministers, MP, they don't pay any tax anymore.
Here is an example of corruption in Africa at its absolute worst. Omar al-Bashir, president of South Sudan, seized power in 1989 in a military coup against the government of Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi, a government which was democratically elected by the people of Sudan. Soon after seizing power, al-Bashir dispersed all political parties in the country, disbanded the country's parliament, and shut down all privately owned media outlets. His reign has been characterized by a civil war in which over 1 million have been killed, while several millions have been displaced. Al-Bashir is still wanted by the International Criminal Court for instigating crimes against humanity, particularly in directing and funding acts of violence against the southern Sudan. A diplomatic WikiLeaks cable revealed that al-Bashir likely siphoned some $9 billion of his country's funds into his private bank accounts in the United Kingdom. The fact that this is possible is in itself ridiculous and shows a major flaw in Africa's institutions. Here's a TED Talk by Fred Swaniker that shows the importance of having good leaders and strong institutions and the impact that this can have on the development of Africa.
So here's a general rule of thumb that I believe in. When societies have strong institutions, the difference that one good leader can make is limited. But when you have weak institutions, then just one good leader can make or break that country. Let me make it a bit more concrete. You become the president of the United States. You think, wow, I've arrived. I'm the most powerful man in the world. So you decide, perhaps let me pass a law. All of a sudden, Congress taps you on the shoulder and say, no, you can't do that. You say, let me try this way. The Senate comes and says, we don't think you can do that. You say, perhaps let me print some money. I think the economy needs a stimulus. The central bank governor will think you're crazy. You might get impeached for that. But if you become the president of Zimbabwe, and you say, you know, I really like this job. I think I'd like to stay in it forever. Well, you just can. You decide you want to print money, you call the central bank governor and say, please, double the money supply. He'll say, okay, yes, sir. Is there anything else I can do for you? This is the power that African leaders have. And this is why they make the most difference on the continent.
Next is foreign aid. Foreign aid can be good and it can be bad. Usually, the best kinds of foreign aid go directly to the people in need. Foreign aid does save lives, particularly during times of extreme distress like during natural disasters. Medical aid saves lives and provides healthcare products and services where they're needed the most. Sanitation can be very beneficial through providing clean water and sanitation facilities, which reduce the risk of illness and disease. There are also benefits that can have questionable motives and maybe even harmful results, such as foreign help tapping natural resources. You can see where this would be a problem when the country providing the support would want some of those resources. And many times the support is just a way to get at the resources. Support may also have the goal of encouraging development, where the money goes to business owners. But this may only benefit large corporations and already wealthy employers, and not necessarily the people who don't have jobs or proper livelihoods. Foreign aid may also help agricultural development, but depending on the situation and the motive of the donor country, this may only benefit large-scale agricultural projects. Many groups and recipient countries have viewed foreign aid suspiciously as nothing more than a tool of influence of donor countries. For example, sign this document, or support this war, and we'll give you money in foreign aid. Or let us farm your land, tap into your natural resources, and set up our companies in your country, and we'll give you money. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing if there were proper policies and regulations in place to govern foreign activity in Africa, and if the money coming in was spent properly. But a lot of the time, this isn't the case. So again, foreign aid can be very beneficial when it's going directly to the people in need. But a lot of the time in Africa, it's going through a corrupt government. Because of the way that foreign aid works, this can cause a lot of problems. This concept is explained very well in a video by a YouTube channel called Polymatter.
As we've seen, every leader lies somewhere on a spectrum of how dependent he is on the population. A rich leader doesn't need to negotiate with the people because he doesn't need their taxes. He can sail the seas on a luxury yacht, free from the demands of his citizens. A good country is one where the government needs your taxes and votes, and therefore must obey some of your demands. The biggest problem with foreign aid is how it changes this relationship. When the leader of a struggling country is suddenly handed billions of dollars in aid, his attitude can afford to change. The average citizen has a lot less leverage with his government when it no longer needs his taxes. The more aid is given, the more free a leader is to do what he wishes. I'm sure I don't have to tell you what that looks like.
Depending on the level of corruption within the government, this situation can be made a lot worse. Because foreign aid is generally given to the countries that are desperate and in need of it, it's actually in the dictator's best interest to keep the country in a desperate state. Because why fix problems when they result in more money? Especially when you can take that money and use it for yourself.
Dictators must provide some minimum conditions to avoid revolution, but giving any more is unnecessary. So when aid reaches citizens, it isn't added to what they normally receive, it replaces it. It allows dictators to move the money they previously spent on citizens into their own wallets. This money buys more power, keeping them on the throne longer and decreasing dependence on the population. On top of all of this, corrupt states often apply fees and taxes to incoming donations. Even money earmarked for specific things tends to magically disappear, and suddenly a new presidential palace is built.
This concept is very true to Africa and plays a major part in the development of the continent. In the recent past, African leaders have been heard arguing that international aid has slowed Africa's growth efforts. During the recent Fourth World Government Summit in Dubai, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda said that donor support should not be relied on forever, but instead be used to build institutions and the economy. He quotes that, "Our vision is to make sure we are able to stand on our own feet and develop our country, attract investment, and do business. There is no reason why we can't grow intra-African trade to the levels we see in America or Europe. What is good is not necessarily being small, but good management of whatever you have, small or big." This brings us to unfair trade policies, another important aspect in African development. Having sustainable economy within the continent will help mitigate corruption of governments as well as misuse of international aid. But because of unfair trade policies, this is made difficult. Introducing fair trade policies for African countries to trade with nations abroad will grow Africa's economy much faster than aid would. An article from poverties.org discusses the causes of poverty in Africa and notes that, quote, "International trade policies, for example, are incomparably more important than international aid to end African poverty and help its countries to integrate into the global market. But the US and the European Union especially are keen to protect their own industries, especially the ones that Africa could compete with, like agriculture."
Meantime, licensing rules and ever-changing quotas constitute for Augustine a serious non-tariff barrier. Not exactly a tax, but still a restriction on trade.
For somebody like me who is in trade advocacy, that appears to be another barrier to trade. They're closing the doors on us. They're opening the doors with one hand, saying we are doing away with quotas, we are removing or reducing taxes, import duties, tariffs, and so on. Meanwhile, with the other hand, they are closing the door by bringing in quality requirements that are far beyond the capacity of local producers, especially the small-scale producers.
Foreign trade is important for creating jobs, especially in landlocked countries that are unable to ship products overseas. This brings us to unemployment, and more importantly, the unemployment among youth. According to the International Labour Organization, the youth's unemployment rate in Africa is expected to exceed 30% this year, and young people will continue to be 3.5 times more likely than adults to be unemployed. Youth unemployment is basically a ticking time bomb because of the current population growth rate. Because Africa has the world's youngest population, the lack of steady formal jobs is an enormous public and economic risk factor. Unemployed youth are more likely to be criminals and maybe lured into militant groups and contribute to political unrest. An example of this is Boko Haram, an Islamic extremist group in Nigeria trying to take the country by force. And this is, of course, a detriment to development. Gabriel Benjamin is a jobless university graduate in Lagos, Nigeria. He says it's common to find young Nigerian university graduates doing menial jobs. He quotes that they clean floors in hotels, sell mobile telephone calling cards, and some even work in factories as laborers. The Brookings Institution is a think tank in the United States. They found that, quote, "Young people in Africa find work, but not in places that pay good wages, develop skills, or provide a measure of job security." The Foundation for Economic Education says that this unemployment problem is a result of having too few formal sector jobs for those who want to work, and that this is caused by poor economic policies. In too many African countries, hiring and firing workers is too expensive. Governments will create legal and regulatory barriers, or fail to address discriminatory social norms that make it more difficult for employers to hire women. They restrict access to certain professions or limit the number of hours women may work. They also create barriers to firing poorly performing workers, which makes it riskier for businesses to take a chance on people with limited work experience. Youth and young women particularly tend to lose out. Fixing labor laws to encourage more participation from women and young people would be one important way to promote job creation. It's also critical to improve the overall business environment and to support conditions that encourage business creation and enable entrepreneurs to do well. Youth unemployment has the added negative of creating mass insecurities within countries. When jobs are scarce, crime and political instability escalate, as well as acts of terrorism and even wars. This brings us to the subject of insecurity. If a country is unstable, there will be a decrease in the production of goods and services, as well as displacement of people. Also, instability will result in the loss of investment, and it scares off potential investors. All in all, insecurity is largely a result of corruption and unemployment, and is a massive barrier to development. Here's a Vice News documentary that shows what can happen in extreme cases, like the Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria.
So basically, this is the old Kunduga Girls Elementary School. It's now being occupied and used as the brigade headquarters for the Army. You have soldiers sleeping in classrooms. The old principal's office is now the operations office. So this used to be the guidance counselor building. Now it's a depot for ammunition. RPG rounds laying around. So this one's the old mathematics lab. You can see this is where the students used to stay and study. Still says mathematics and ratio on the board. And you can see this whole place is just bombed out. Two schools that used to be places of learning and education had now become graveyards.
Population growth is another important factor, especially if the rate of development stays the same as it is right now. Based on current trends, Africa as a whole is projected to double in size by 2050. Between 2050 and 2100, according to the United Nations, it could almost double again. This means that the continent would have to quadruple its efforts to maintain the current level of investment in health and education, which is already too low. You can see where the problem occurs, especially with the current levels of unemployment. Here's some statistics from CNDB International.
Africa has the second largest population after Asia, but it's far less dense than Europe's. So if it has the space to accommodate more people, then why are so many analysts worried? Because they believe Africa doesn't have the infrastructure to handle it. In Nigeria, the National Population Commission says this increase puts a severe strain on a nation to provide enough schools and health facilities. Add in an extra billion or so people in the next 30 years and you have a big problem.
So with current development rates, a population boom in Africa is basically a time bomb. But if development surpasses the growing population, Africa will become a world superpower with a massive young workforce and more than enough land and resources for the population. But that's only if enough resources actually stay in Africa.
In Africa, the side effects are numerous, from pressures on food and water supplies to an increased threat of corruption at local and national levels. So what are the solutions? It's called a demographic dividend. Governments across sub-Saharan Africa will be hoping that fast population growth will create a young workforce that can drive economic growth. But that can only happen if there are enough jobs for them to fill. According to recent research, between 18 and 20 million jobs will need to be created across the continent over the next 25 years. And if that doesn't happen, millions of unemployed young people will become a perfect recruiting environment for both militant Islamist group Boko Haram and human traffickers selling dreams of a better life in Europe.
This brings us to a very direct challenge facing Africa and much of the population. Droughts and famine were voted as one of the most pressing issues in the World Happiness Report in 2017, and they're caused by a number of issues, including overpopulation.
Africa is facing its worst humanitarian crisis in decades. According to the UN, it's the world's largest crisis in 70 years. 20 million people across the continent don't have enough food. Hundreds have died and many more lives remain at risk. Much of Somalia is facing emergency conditions, and in parts of South Sudan, famine has already been declared. The root causes vary. The weather events El Niño and La Niña have led to droughts in eastern and southern Africa. In northeastern Nigeria, a brutal insurgency by the terror group Boko Haram has displaced thousands and disrupted harvests. An infestation of army worms has decimated crops in southern Africa. Across the continent, conflict and land management practices have exacerbated the problems. The Congo River is experiencing a 50% drop in its water level as a result of the drought, something that hasn't happened in 100 years. Camels, which can survive 3 months without water, are dying in Somalia. A similar crisis struck the Horn of Africa in 2011, killing as many as 260,000 people. National governments and aid organizations say they learned important lessons from this tragedy, but some critics fear it may not be enough. As the story unfolds, the Voice of America will continue to cover the human toll and the international response with reporters on the ground.
Another challenge facing Africa is the geographical disadvantage that many countries have. This one does not affect the people as directly, but does directly and substantially affect the economy of a country. Exports play a major role in economic development, but considering the current state of Africa, the export market is inaccessible to many landlocked countries. A country like Switzerland is landlocked, but it's surrounded by stable economies, creating a platform for trade. On the other hand, most landlocked countries in Africa are surrounded by unstable and conflict-filled countries. The inability to transport goods through neighboring countries with sea access has inhibited landlocked countries' export growth. Uganda is a landlocked country bordered by South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and stands as a good example of this. Both of its neighbors feature civil wars all year, and therefore Uganda has very limited access to shipping overseas. Finally, there's education, or in many cases a lack of education. An educated population is also necessary in developing economy, but a lack of skilled labor and general education makes this difficult in Africa. Some households cannot afford basic education for their children. Although some governments in the region have taken up the matter of basic education provision as a government project, many areas lack schools, and even where schools are, they're sparsely located, posing a challenge to the young children who would rather help at home than make the long walk to school. Also, schools are many times underfunded. The World Economic Forum says that, quote, Africa's children often face schools that are badly equipped and underfunded, with teachers who are poorly trained when they're in the classroom at all. Educational quality and quantity are both difficult problems facing Africa, and they result in a knowledge gap. This refers to a concept in which the individuals with a higher socioeconomic status absorb information presented by media at a faster rate than those with a lower socioeconomic status. This gap is present between the rich and the poor, as well as between men and women. Gender inequality in education is a problem. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization quotes that, "We will never achieve gender equality unless we tackle the roots of imbalance, social barriers, and entrenched discriminatory social norms." Irina Bokova, Director General of the UN organization, highlights the importance of equality in education. She says that, quote, "Educating a girl educates a nation. It unleashes a ripple effect that changes the world unmistakably for the better." She also says that success in this endeavor is simply not possible without educated, empowered girls, young women, and mothers. UN members have recently set an ambitious agenda for the next 15 years to end poverty, hunger, and address inequality, which includes ensuring that all children have quality primary and secondary education. In conclusion, Africa faces many difficult challenges but is still developing at a decent rate. Research and reports from African development organizations and sources such as the United Nations show the major challenges facing the continent. But because Africa is huge, diverse, and complicated, it is difficult to make sense of what's going on in the continent and how the continent interacts with the rest of the world. There also isn't much in terms of controversy or differing points of view surrounding the topic, as it's very academic and based on research. And it's a current problem where the focus is more on the future than it is on the past, so perspectives are generally research-based and hypothetical. There are a lot of different challenges that hinder African development, though, and these vary in importance depending on the country. But the most urgent problems are generally agreed upon within organizations like the United Nations, Health Poverty Action, the Brookings Institution, as well as various news sources both inside and outside of Africa. Important African academics and leaders all have similar points of view on the challenges facing the continent, and their opinions are usually based on the country they're from. All important parties agree on the common problems of corruption, poor governance, unemployment, insecurity, population growth, and droughts and famine, and agree that these problems differ in importance depending on the country and situation. Misplaced international aid, unfair trade policies, geographical disadvantage, and education in the knowledge gap are the more broad problems that affect all of Africa to varying degrees. They're also agreed upon and are discussed mostly among the more academic sources. Africa will continue to develop, but with growing concerns of overpopulation and insecurity, the current rate of development must be improved. Africa has immense natural and human resources, and if development is achieved at a quick enough rate to catch up to the rest of the world, the continent will have a massive future both locally and within the global economy. Thanks for watching.